The measure of command is not found in the orders given, but in the silence after the storm, when those who followed you home understand why they survived. The heat came off the runway in waves, distorting the horizon into something liquid and uncertain. Colonel Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the flight line, watching the C-130 that had carried her to Forward Operating Base Resolute taxi toward the maintenance hangars. Behind her, the base sprawled across 300 acres of Iraqi desert. Barracks, operations centers, ammunition depots, fuel farms, and the 800 souls whose lives had just become her responsibility. She was 32 years old, the youngest base commander in the history of United States Air Force expeditionary operations. And every person on this installation knew it. The welcoming party approached with the careful precision of people who had rehearsed their civility. Colonel Marcus Webb, her deputy 20 years her senior, passed over for command 3 times, walked at the head of the delegation. His salute was technically perfect and emotionally empty. Colonel Chen, welcome to Resolute. Thank you, Colonel Webb. She returned the salute, noting the slight tightness around his eyes, the almost imperceptible set of his jaw. She'd seen that look before, many times. I've reviewed the transition briefings. I'd like to walk the perimeter before sunset. Webb's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked. Ma'am, the previous commander preferred to settle in first, review the operations from the TOC. I'm not the previous commander. Sarah kept her voice neutral, professional. I want to see what my people see, every day. She watched the information travel through the assembled officers like current through wire, glances exchanged, postures subtly shifting. The new commander wanted to walk the line, in August, in Iraq, when the temperature hadn't dropped below 115 degrees in 3 weeks. Good. Let them wonder. That night, alone in the commander's quarters, Sarah opened the footlocker she'd carried through 4 deployments. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been her grandmother's, lay a collection of objects that told the story of who she was, or who she was trying to become. A photograph, faded now, of her father in his flight suit, standing beside an F-4 Phantom at Da Nang. He'd died when she was 6, shot down over Laos in an operation that wouldn't be declassified for another 20 years. She'd grown up knowing only that he was gone and that he'd been brave. The details came later, piece by piece, earned through her own service like secrets shared between warriors across time. A challenge coined from her first squadron commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, one of the first women to fly combat missions in the Gulf War. You'll have to be twice as good, Hayes had told her on her first day, and half as loud about it. That's the price of going first. A fragment of metal, twisted and blackened, salvaged from the wreckage of the helicopter she'd crash-landed in Afghanistan 3 years ago. She'd walked away with a shattered femur and 7 crew members who would have died if she'd ejected instead of riding the burning aircraft down. And a letter, never sent, written to her mother on the night before that mission, the one she'd thought might be her last. Sarah set the letter aside and picked up the framed photograph of her father. She studied his face, looking for answers that weren't there. I made it, Dad, she said softly. I made it to command. The photograph offered no response, but somewhere in the silence she felt the weight of expectation, not his, but her own. She'd fought for 20 years to reach this moment. Now she had to prove she deserved it. She turned off the light and listened to the distant thrum of generators, the occasional crack of gunfire from beyond the wire, the restless pulse of a base that never truly slept. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The first week was a study in institutional resistance. Sarah established her command style quickly, visible, direct, demanding. She walked the perimeter every morning before dawn, inspecting guard positions, checking equipment, speaking with the young airmen and soldiers who manned the base's defenses. She attended every briefing, asked questions that made staff officers uncomfortable, and made decisions that broke from established patterns. Colonel Webb observed it all with the patient skepticism of a man waiting for failure. He never questioned her orders directly. He was too professional for that. But his compliance carried the subtle weight of doubt. He followed her instructions precisely, offering neither suggestion nor objection, giving her nothing to work with and nothing to correct. It was, Sarah recognized, a sophisticated form of resistance. He would obey her completely and watch her fail on her own. The other officers took their cues from him. They were respectful, correct, and distant. They answered her questions with minimum necessary information. They executed her orders with minimum necessary initiative. They treated her like a temporary condition, something to be endured until the natural order reasserted itself. She understood. She'd spent her entire career understanding. The first crack appeared during a logistics briefing on the 8th day. Major Torres, the supply officer, was walking her through the ammunition consumption rates when Sarah interrupted him. "These numbers don't match the security reports." Torres blinked. "Ma'am, the perimeter defense firing logs show 40% more small arms expenditure than what's reflected in your resupply requests. Either your inventories are wrong or someone's moving ammunition off the books." The room went silent. Torres's face reddened. Colonel Webb leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "I'll look into it, ma'am," Torres said finally. "You'll look into it with me. This afternoon, bring your NCO and every inventory record for the past 6 months." The investigation took 3 days. What they found was worse than ammunition theft. It was institutional negligence. Years of loose accounting, casual record keeping, and comfortable assumptions had created a supply chain riddled with gaps. Critical equipment was listed in locations where it didn't exist. Maintenance schedules had been falsified to meet inspection requirements. The base's defensive capabilities on paper bore only passing resemblance to reality. Sarah gathered her senior staff in the operations center on the 4th day. She laid out the findings without accusation, without anger, just facts, presented with the quiet precision of someone who had learned that truth was more devastating than rhetoric. "This base has been operating on luck and habit," she said. "That ends today. I want a complete equipment audit. Every weapon, every vehicle, every piece of gear. I want realistic maintenance schedules. And I want honest reporting. Not the numbers that make us look good, but the numbers that tell us what we actually have." She paused, letting her eyes move across the assembled officers. "I know this isn't what you expected when you got a new commander. I know some of you are wondering how long I'll last before I give up and go back to doing things the old way. But here's what you need to understand. I didn't fight for 20 years to get this command so I could pretend everything was fine while our people died from preventable failures." She stood, placing her hands flat on the conference table. "I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to make sure the 800 men and women on this base go home to their families. If that means some of you are uncomfortable, I can live with that. What I can't live with is explaining to a mother or a father that their child died because I was too worried about hurting feelings to fix what was broken." The room remained silent. Sarah nodded once. "Dismissed." The weeks that followed were difficult, and they were necessary. Sarah drove her staff hard, demanding accountability and transparency. She spent hours in the motor pool, the maintenance bays, the ammunition storage facilities, learning the truth of what she commanded through her own observations. She instituted new inspection protocols, new reporting requirements, new standards that some called impossible and others called overdue. The resistance continued, but it began to change in character. What had been unified skepticism fragmented into something more complex. Some officers discovered that competence was more comfortable than cutting corners. Others found that honest reporting, while initially painful, eliminated the constant anxiety of concealing problems. And slowly, imperceptibly, the culture began to shift. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez was the first to say it directly. She found Sarah during one of her dawn perimeter walks, falling into step. Beside her, without invitation. A breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks earlier. "Ma'am, can I speak freely?" "Always." Vasquez was quiet for a moment, her boots crunching on gravel as they walked. "The troops have been talking about the changes you've made. And most of them think you're too hard. They say you expect too much, push too fast, don't understand how things work out here." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "And what do you think, Sergeant?" Vasquez glanced at her, then back at the sunrise bleeding red across the desert horizon. "I think you're the first commander who's actually looked at the problems instead of pretending they don't exist. I think you care more about whether we survive than whether we like you. And I think—" She hesitated. "I think you're exactly what we needed, even if most people don't know it yet." They walked in silence for a while, watching the base come to life around them. Vehicles starting, generators humming, soldiers and airmen emerging from barracks to begin another day. "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah said finally. "That means more than you know." It was a small thing, a fragment of faith in an ocean of doubt, but it was a start. The attack came on a Tuesday. Sarah was in the operations center, reviewing intelligence reports, when the first mortar round impacted near the eastern perimeter. The explosion shook the building, sending dust cascading from the ceiling tiles. "Contact! Multiple incoming rounds!" The watch officer's voice cut through the sudden chaos. "Eastern and northern perimeters both taking fire." Sarah was already moving toward the communications station. Around her, the TOC transformed from a routine briefing center into a combat command post. Officers and NCOs racing to their stations, radios crackling with urgent traffic. The orchestrated pandemonium of war. "Get me a full picture," she ordered. "I want to know what we're facing." The picture that emerged over the next 5 minutes was worse than anything they'd planned for. This wasn't a harassment attack, the random mortar fire that insurgents sometimes lobbed at the base before melting back into the desert. This was a coordinated assault. Dozens of fighters were advancing from multiple directions, using the mortar barrage as cover for a ground approach. "Ma'am, we've got movement at the east gate." Lieutenant Colonel Webb appeared at her shoulder, his face tight with controlled urgency. "They're breaching the perimeter wire." Sarah studied the tactical display, processing the information, weighing options. The base's defenses were good. She'd spent weeks making them better, but no defense was perfect, and the attackers were pressing their advantage, probing for weaknesses, testing the response. "Move the QRF to reinforce the east side," she ordered, "but keep half in reserve. This feels like a fixing attack." "Ma'am?" Webb's eyebrows rose. "They want us to commit everything to the east, which means the main assault is coming from somewhere else." She turned to the intelligence officer. "What's our drone coverage on the southern approach?" "Minimal, ma'am. Most of our assets are focused on the active contact areas." "Retask 1. I want eyes on the fuel farm." The drone imagery arrived 3 minutes later, and Sarah felt her suspicions crystallize into cold certainty. A larger force, at least 50 fighters, heavily armed, was moving through a dry wadi toward the base's fuel storage area. If they reached it, if they managed to ignite the tanks, 800 people, families waiting at home, letters that would never be sent. "All elements, this is actual." Sarah keyed the base-wide tactical frequency, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her system. "We have confirmed hostile force approaching the fuel farm from the south. I am repositioning our defense. QRF elements will hold eastern perimeter. Security forces will execute option Bravo. Acknowledge." The acknowledgements came back in quick succession. Around her, the TOC staff watched with a mixture of apprehension and something else. Something that might have been the first flicker of genuine confidence. Colonel Webb appeared at her side again. "Ma'am, option Bravo commits most of our reserves. If you're wrong about the main threat, then I'll own it." Sarah met his eyes. "But I'm not wrong. The eastern attack is designed to draw our attention while they hit the fuel farm. It's what I would do." Webb held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Orders acknowledged, ma'am. I'll coordinate the repositioning personally." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Colonel, I think you're right." It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was everything. The battle lasted 4 hours. Sarah commanded from the 2C, but her voice was everywhere. On the tactical frequencies, in the ears of squad leaders and machine gun teams, guiding, adjusting, responding to the fluid chaos of combat with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment. She'd been right about the fuel farm. The main assault force reached the perimeter wire just as the repositioned security teams arrived to meet them. The fighting was intense, desperate, and ultimately decisive. The attackers, caught between prepared defenses and unexpected resistance, broke against the positions Sarah had established. But the cost was real. 3 Americans died that night. 7 more were wounded, some severely. The base's eastern barracks took direct mortar hits, and the damage to infrastructure would take weeks to repair. When the last of the attackers had withdrawn or been neutralized, when the firing had stopped and the dust had begun to settle, Sarah walked the perimeter one more time, not as an inspection, as a vigil. She needed to see what her people had endured. She needed to remember what command truly meant. She found staff. Sergeant Vasquez near the fuel farm, sitting against a concrete barrier with her weapon across her knees. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat, and there was blood on her uniform. Not her own, she explained. She'd helped carry one of the wounded to the aid station. "How are you, Sergeant?" Vasquez looked up at her, and Sarah saw the exhaustion there, but also something else. Pride, belief. "We held them, ma'am, just like you planned." "We held them," Sarah agreed. "Together?" She sat down beside the sergeant, ignoring the breach of protocol, ignoring everything except this moment of shared humanity in the aftermath of violence. They sat in silence, watching the first light of dawn paint the desert in shades of gold and rose. "Ma'am," Vasquez said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "During the attack, when everything was happening, you never seemed scared, not once. How do you do that?" Sarah considered the question. She thought about all the times she'd been terrified. The crash landing in Afghanistan, the ambushes in Syria, the countless moments when death had felt close enough to touch. She thought about her father, climbing into a cockpit knowing he might never return, doing it anyway because someone had to. The fear is always there, she said quietly. You don't make it go away. You just learn not to let it make decisions for you. You focus on the job, on the people depending on you, and you trust your training to carry you through. She paused, watching the sunrise. And sometimes you remember that there are things more frightening than dying, like living with the knowledge that you could have done more and didn't. Vasquez was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Thank you, ma'am, for being here, for being who you are. Sarah didn't respond. There was nothing to say, but she reached over and placed her hand briefly on the sergeant's shoulder, a gesture of connection, of shared experience, of the bond that forms between people who have faced the darkness together and emerged into the light. The memorial service was held 3 days later. Sarah stood before the assembled base. 800 faces turned toward her and spoke the names of the fallen. Airman First Class Marcus Young, 23 years old, from Toledo, Ohio. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Torres, 31, from San Antonio, Texas. Captain Diana Kowalski, 28, from Boise, Idaho. She spoke of their courage, their sacrifice, their dedication to their mission and their comrades. She spoke of the families they'd left behind, the futures they'd never have, the debt that could never be repaid. And then she spoke of something else. These 3 Americans died defending this base. Defending you, she said, her voice carrying across the silent assembly. They died because they believed in something larger than themselves. They died trusting that their sacrifice would mean something. She paused, letting the weight of this moment settle. I cannot bring them back. I cannot undo what happened, but I can promise you this. Their trust was not misplaced. This base, this family, will honor their memory by being worthy of it, by protecting each other, by doing our jobs with excellence and integrity, by going home to our loved ones and carrying their stories with us. She looked out at the faces before her, young and old, skeptical and trusting, united in this moment of shared grief and shared purpose. That is the only memorial that matters, not words, not ceremonies, but the way we live, the way we serve, the way we remember. After the service, Colonel Webb found her standing alone by the memorial wall, where the names of the fallen had been added to the roll of honor. That was a good speech, ma'am, he said quietly. It wasn't a speech. Sarah didn't turn from the wall. It was a promise. Webb was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, and his voice was different, softer, stripped of the careful neutrality that had characterized their interactions. I owe you an apology. Now she did turn, surprised. When you first arrived, Webb continued, I thought you were too young, too inexperienced. I thought the brass had made a mistake, promoting you over people who'd spent decades earning their place. He paused. I was wrong. Colonel, let me finish. He met her eyes squarely. What you did during the attack, the way you read the situation, anticipated their plan, repositioned our forces, that wasn't luck. That was command, real command, the kind you can't fake and you can't teach. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, a coin worn smooth by years of handling. This was my father's, he said. He carried it through 2 tours in Vietnam. He gave it to me when I commissioned, and he told me to pass it on when I found someone who deserved it. He pressed the coin into Sarah's palm. You deserve it, Colonel, more than anyone I've served with. Sarah looked down at the coin, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented, not just acceptance, but recognition. The acknowledgement, finally, that she belonged here. Thank you, Marcus, she said quietly. I'll carry it with honor. Webb nodded once, then turned and walked away. Sarah remained at the memorial wall, holding the coin, thinking about all the people who had doubted her, and all the people who had believed. The months that followed were different, not easier. Nothing about command was ever easy, but different. The skepticism that had greeted her arrival faded, replaced by something more substantial, trust, confidence, the quiet certainty that comes from shared hardship and proven competence. Sarah continued to walk the perimeter every morning, but now she was joined by others, junior officers seeking guidance, NCOs reporting problems before they became crises, young airmen who wanted to understand what leadership looked like up close. She told them the same things Colonel Hayes had told her years ago. You'll have to be twice as good and half as loud about it. That's the price of going first. But every time you succeed, you make it easier for someone who comes after you. That's the real victory, not the recognition, but the doors you open. She thought often about those who would follow. The women entering service academies today, the lieutenants starting their careers, the captains dreaming of command. They would face their own doubts, their own resistance, their own moments of wondering if they belonged. She hoped they would find mentors to guide them, teams to support them, opportunities to prove themselves. And she hoped, when their moment came, they would be ready. The letter arrived on a Thursday, carried in the mail pouch from headquarters. Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately. The careful, elegant script of Patricia Hayes, now retired, living in a small town in Montana. Sarah, I've been following your career from a distance, the way old soldiers do, through the grapevine, through mutual friends, through the official channels that carry news of those we've mentored. I heard about what happened at Resolute, the attack, the defense, the way you held that base together when everything was falling apart. I heard about the memorial service too, about what you said and how you said it. I want you to know that I am proud of you. Not because you succeeded, though you did, but because you succeeded by being exactly who you are. You didn't try to lead like a man. You didn't try to make yourself smaller to fit expectations. You led like Sarah Chen, and that was enough. More than enough. When I was your age, I used to wonder if it would ever get easier. The proving, the doubting, the endless cycle of earning respect that others received automatically. I wanted to believe that someday I could just be a pilot, just be an officer, without the qualifiers and the questions. Now I know the truth. It doesn't get easier, not for us, not yet. But it gets better. Not because the world changes, but because we do. We grow stronger. We grow wiser. We learn to carry the weight, not as a burden, but as a purpose. You're part of something larger than yourself, Sarah. You're part of a chain that stretches back through generations and forward into a future we can barely imagine. Every time you stand up, every time you refuse to be diminished, every time you succeed against expectation, you're making that future more possible. That's your legacy, not the medals or the commands or the history books. The paths you open for those who follow. Carry it well. Patricia Sarah read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the footlocker with the photograph of her father and the fragment of wreckage and the coin from Marcus Webb. She thought about legacy, what it meant, how it was built, who got to claim it. She thought about all the women who had served before her, in all the roles and all the conflicts, facing all the doubts and proving themselves again and again. She thought about the ones whose names were remembered and the countless more whose names were not. She thought about what she wanted to leave behind when her time came to step aside. Not glory, not recognition, just a path, worn a little smoother by her passage, just a door, held open a little wider, just the knowledge that when someone else stood where she had stood, young, capable, doubted, they would find the way a little less difficult. That was worth something. That was worth everything. Sarah Chen's tour at Forward Operating Base Resolute lasted 18 months. In that time, she transformed the base from a demoralized outpost into a model of operational excellence. The systems she established, the standards she enforced, the culture she cultivated, they became templates for other commands to follow. Officers who had served under her were promoted. They carried her lessons forward into their own units, their own careers. When her orders came for reassignment, to the Pentagon to help develop the next generation of expeditionary doctrine, the farewell ceremony was not the perfunctory ritual she had expected. The entire base assembled on the flight line where she had arrived 18 months ago, to the cold stares and careful distance of people who thought she didn't belong. Now they stood in formation, 800 faces that had become familiar, voices that had become trusted, hearts that had learned to follow where she led. Colonel Webb, now a friend, a confidant, someone she could rely on without reservation, presented her with a shadow box containing the symbols of her command. The unit coin, the base flag, a letter signed by every officer and senior NCO, expressing gratitude and respect. "You changed us," he said simply. "Not with orders or discipline, but by being exactly who you were. We're better because of you." Sarah accepted the shadow box, looked out at the assembled formation, and felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She thought of everything she'd experienced here. The doubts, the challenges, the attack, the losses, the slow, patient work of earning trust one day at a time. "I came here uncertain whether I could do this job," she said. "Not uncertain of my training or my skills, but uncertain whether I would be allowed to prove them. I knew the doubts I would face. I knew the resistance. I knew what it meant to be first." She paused, gathering herself. "What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was how good it would feel to be wrong, to discover that when the moment came, when the pressure was greatest, you judged me not by my age or my gender, but by my actions. You gave me a chance to earn your trust, and then you gave me something even more precious. You gave me your trust." She looked out at them, her people, the family she had built through shared sacrifice and proven competence. "I will carry that with me forever, and I promise you this: wherever I go, whatever I do, I will never forget what we built here. I will never forget you." The formation broke into applause, genuine, sustained, the kind that comes not from obligation, but from the heart. Sarah stood in the midst of it, accepting what it meant, letting herself feel the validation she had worked so long to achieve. But even as she did, she was thinking about the next commander, about the young woman, somewhere out there, who would step into the same doubts and face the same questions. She hoped she had made the path a little easier. That was the only victory that truly mattered. The C-130 lifted off from Forward Operating Base Resolute at 0600, carrying Sarah Chen toward her next assignment and away from the place that had defined her. She sat in the canvas jump seat, watching through the small window as the base shrank beneath her. The barracks and hangars, the perimeter roads, the patch of desert where she had walked every morning for 18 months, learning her people and earning their respect. In her pocket, she carried 3 coins now, her father's memory, Marcus Webb's faith, and a new one, pressed into her hand at the last moment by Staff Sergeant Vasquez, inscribed with words that made her eyes sting. She showed up. That's how it starts. That's how it always starts. Sarah closed her eyes and let the vibration of the aircraft carry her toward whatever came next. She thought about the young woman she had been, standing in Patricia Hayes' office, terrified and determined and desperate to prove herself. She thought about the woman she had become, tested by fire, tempered by doubt, proven beyond question, and she thought about the women who would follow, the ones who hadn't been born yet, the ones who would grow up in a world shaped by everything she and others like her had endured. They wouldn't face exactly the same challenges. The world was changing, slowly, imperfectly. But they would face challenges of their own. And when they did, they would need the same things she had needed: mentors to guide them, opportunities to prove themselves, the courage to show up every day until the doubters became believers. That was the work. That was the mission. Not the commands or the medals or the history books. Just the patient, daily effort of being worthy, of proving that capability had no gender, of opening doors that others might walk through. It was exhausting sometimes, the endless cycle of doubt and demonstration, the weight of representing something larger than yourself, the knowledge that your failures would be held against every woman who came after you, while your successes would be dismissed as exceptions. But it was also an honor, a privilege, a sacred trust passed from one generation to the next. The plane banked eastward, toward the rising sun, toward the future that was waiting to be built. And Colonel Sarah Chen, the youngest base commander in United States Air Force history, allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe that everything she had endured had been worth it. Not for the recognition, for the path, for the doors, for every woman who would come after her and find the way a little less difficult. History rarely remembers the quiet acts of courage, the daily battles fought not with weapons but with competence, the victories won not through confrontation but through persistence. It rarely remembers the pioneers who opened doors they themselves might never walk through again, who carried burdens they never asked for, who proved themselves not once but 1,000 times. But the people who served with them remember, the ones who followed remember. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what stories are for. To honor those who showed up, day after day, doubt after doubt, until the question was no longer whether they belonged, but how many others they could bring with them. She never called herself a pioneer, but every officer who served under her still tells the story. Because courage like that doesn't fade. It opens doors, and the ones who walk through never forget who made it possible.